Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Chapter 3, Key Issue 3 and 4. Two big questions that we're going to be looking at today is why do people migrate and why do migrants face challenges? All right, let's go ahead and get into it. When we look at reasons for migration, there are big factors here at play. We call them push and pull factors. Push factors cause us to leave a place, they push us out, and the pull factors cause us to come to a place. They pull us to a specific location. And there are three common factors that go along with both push and pull. The first is political. All right, we look at the idea of some forced migrations, refugees, internally displaced persons, or people seeking asylum from their country because of some kind of political disagreement or governmental disagreement or persecution from the government. All right, our next factor is environmental. And we look at that, that could be, if it's pulling you to that place, could be because you want a desirable condition. It could be that you want to live in the mountains, or you want to live by the beach or on the ocean. And so that might pull you to a specific reason. When we look at natural disasters being a push factor, we could see other things. It could be like Hurricane Katrina. After Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, a lot of people never came back. They couldn't afford to go back to that area and rebuild, so they moved to other cities, specifically like Houston and other areas like Tennessee as well. All right, so they left Louisiana altogether in a lot of cases. We also look at maybe you don't really like super cold winters like we have here. That might be an environmental reason to push you out of that location. Finally, we have economic reasons, and economic reasons are usually the number one factor for why people migrate. And a lot of times we look at, could they be voluntary reasons? Sort of. But when we talk about economic, we're talking about the reason that you move is because you need a job. You need to have a job to make money for you and your family to survive. And so people that desire employment may leave a location that does not have a lot of jobs, or they may see a place that has a lot of jobs and they may decide that it would be best for them and their family to move there. And so we talk about why do most migrants move to the United States or Minnesota? Why do they come here? Well, because Minnesota overall, compared to most states, has a pretty good economy and we have a lot of jobs available. And we also see why would people come here to our country? Well, again, the United States tends to have a lot of jobs for people, especially entry-level jobs, if they want to move here and have a job, or when we look at those economic reasons. Okay. Obviously, there's others too, environmental and political reasons too. We look at the United States as typically being viewed as being free and having freedom, the idea of a democracy. And so that may entice people to come here too. When we talk about forced migration, that's the idea of like slavery or forcing someone to move from a specific location. And one of the best examples of that in the United States history is the Trail of Tears. And this is part of the 1830 Indian Removal Act, where Native Americans were taken from specific locations. You can see where they lived there in the different kind of highlighted areas, the tribal lands, and they were forced to literally walk and move to the new location where they decided to move a majority of those tribes to that reservation land in Oklahoma. All right, so that would be forced migration, or slavery might be forced migration, where you're picking someone up and ripping them from their home and their family and their group and sending them somewhere else, specifically like the slave trade. When we talk about global examples of forced migration, we just kind of talked about U.S. slavery and the Indian Removal Act. In other parts of the world, we look at a number of Irish people leaving Ireland and moving to the United States, largely because of the English control over the United Kingdom and over Great Britain and over Ireland itself at the time when it was still part of that. We look at Britain to Australia. People that were sent to Australia to live at that colony were either debtors or convicts in a lot of cases. The British shipped them out to their Australian penal colony at the time. And then we look at during Stalinist Russia or the Soviet Union, a lot of political prisoners were shipped out to Siberia. If they weren't killed, they were shipped off to Siberian gulags to be basically put in prisons there. So we see some of the refugee migration here, sending and receiving some different parts. So we can see a lot of people are going to the United States, Canada. You can see a lot of those countries in Europe are receiving a lot of people as well. And then you look at some countries that are receiving refugees that you might not think. You look at like Chad and Egypt and Ethiopia. They are receiving refugees, largely because you can see that the places near those countries like Sudan and South Sudan and Democratic Republic of Congo are having people leaving. There's it's the origin of people leaving those areas. Or we look at also Central African Republic is in there. There's Somalia. Those places are having either conflicts, political conflicts, or there might be some sort of political refugee or asylum being sought by a number of different groups of people, and that's why they would be leaving. Now, let's take a look at some of these factors individually. We talk about economic migration, and so we look at developing countries versus developed countries. And so when we talk about developing countries, we're getting into things like South and East Asia or Southwest Asia, and we look at South and East Asia looking at the largest source of working migrants in the world. And they tend to immigrate to the United States or other Asian countries to find jobs. When we talk about Southwest Asia, this is a destination for a lot of people from Southern Asian countries or even Filipino workers. And the biggest pull or the biggest job industry there is the oil industry. They are extremely difficult jobs, but a lot of people will take those jobs because they want a job. And that's one of those jobs they can take. We look at developed countries, so places like the United States and Canada tend to be nations of immigrants. And so we see a lot of people have come from other parts of the world to live in the U.S. and Canada specifically. We also see maybe Ireland is a little bit like that, but not to the level of a U.S. or a Canada. And when we get to the idea of refugee versus voluntary economic immigrants, refugees obviously are people who are leaving because of a specific thing. They're being forced out of their country because of war or government issues or being persecuted. But when we look at voluntary economic immigrants, those people tend to be leaving to find maybe better jobs or find jobs in another place. So you see Ireland's immigration patterns here, and you can see the number of immigrants who are coming to the country from, if we just take from 2000 to 2017, moved up and down quite a bit, and you see the net migration, they're actually losing a lot of people, right? So people were leaving that country versus coming to that country at that time. And they've seen a little bit of a resurgence in net migration as of late. One of the big things that migrants tend to do when they are in their new location is they tend to send what we call remittances. And so when we talk about remittances, what we're basically talking about is money that migrants are sending back home to the country of their origin, usually to friends or family, to help them survive back at home as well. And so a good example of this is the country of Tajikistan. 50% of the gross domestic product in Tajikistan comes from people sending money back from the United States to the people back at home. All right, so that's an enormous amount of money for that country to be gaining just based on people sending money back to family and friends. And so when we look at India and China, also have the highest remittance totals as well. Okay, so very high numbers there when we talk about remittance. So the idea is to make money somewhere else, send the money back to the people that need the money back at home. We look at some of the characteristics of migrants. Age and gender play a big role here. The highest group when we look at age is usually about the ages of 20 to 39 years old. Those are the people that are most likely to make these large migrant groups here, make up these large migrant groups where they're heading to different countries specifically. And we see the number of children is actually increasing. That's changed in recent years. And we see that largely because of the number of wars going on, specifically throughout the Middle East and in Africa, where we're seeing children moving much, much more as well. When we talk about gender, this is becoming a new trend as well. The percent of women is now at about 55%. So we tend to see women migrating much more. And that's a change, again, from recent years because of all the wars going on in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Middle East. A lot of women and children have had to now start shifting and moving to new countries because of that forced migration, the refugee status. Developed countries tend to have higher number of women in the labor force, which is another pull factor for women. We look at policies tend to make it easier for wives to join their husbands later on. So it's very possible a husband has gone to a new country or migrated to a new country for a job, sends money back home, sends those remittances back home, and then eventually they can afford for the wife to come as well, or the rest of the family to come to that new country as well. So we talk about different types of government immigration policies. We do need to know a little bit about these policies. Some of the factors that go into governments making up policies for immigration. Public opinion plays a big role. How does the public and how do the people of that country perceive immigrants coming into the country? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Another factor is how well is the economy doing? Is it doing well or is it doing poorly? If it's doing poorly, they're not going to want as many people coming in because there's less jobs available. What kind of resources are there? All right, do they have good access to resources, or are resources tight? If resources are tight, countries are not going to want more people to come in. And then finally, we look at international relations. How well does that country that's creating the policy get along with other countries? All right, what kind of policies have they put in place prior to this? When we look at the policy specifically with the United Nations numbers, right now there are 24 countries in the United Nations who are increasing immigrants, 25 who are trying to reduce the number of immigrants, and 120 who are trying to maintain the current level that they are currently at. And then there's 27 member countries that don't have an immigration policy at all. All right, and so when we look at the United States, the question is, where does the United States fall on immigration policy? And our immigration policy has changed quite a bit over the last decade or so. We'll go a little bit more in depth on it a little later too. Here's the year 2015. We look at the immigration policies here. Again, you can see if you look at the date is obviously important here. Looking at how immigration was working, you can see some of the problems in the Middle East. Those countries were trying to reduce immigration during that time. You can see some of the other countries in Europe specifically encouraging more immigration. All right, Germany is a really good example of a country encouraging immigration, or the kind of the Eastern Bloc. When we talk about Eastern Europe, they are trying to encourage immigration as well. Russia encouraging immigration, trying to bring more people in to the country because a lot of those countries are having lower population growth rates at this point, or even possibly negative population growth rates. So how has recent migration affected the United States? All right, this is kind of going back to a little bit of our policy as well. But when we look at unauthorized or undocumented immigration, we talk about this as being one of those hot button issues that you hear a lot in government and in policy. There's about 11 million people in the United States as of 2015 who are unauthorized or undocumented immigrants. 50% of those people have come from Mexico, and most of them live in California and Texas. And we'll show you a map here in a minute about that. The principal reason that they are coming here is because, just like we talked about the number one factor, economic reasons for push and pull. So the number one reason is jobs. They want jobs that they can be employed in and obviously send money back home and eventually go back home as well in a lot of cases. And so many people are employed in construction and hospitality industries. All right, so service industries basically. They make up about 5% of the U.S. labor force. And so when we look at it, the big question is, how do unauthorized immigrants hurt the United States and how do they help the United States? And so there are pros and cons to both sides here. We obviously can't do a debate via this video here, but I mean, I would say one of the pros would be they supply 5% of our labor force. That's quite a bit of labor force in the United States. The con to that might be that they aren't paying taxes because they are undocumented. So that money is going directly into their pocket. They're not paying taxes to the government off of their salaries that's being made. All right. So again, there's pros and cons. We talk about, well, maybe they're taking jobs that U.S. people or U.S. citizens want. Well, that's possible, and that's in some cases might be the case. But in the other case, we look at a lot of the jobs that they're taking are not typical jobs that people from the United States would be working in. All right. But again, pros and cons to both sides here. Here is your distribution of unauthorized immigrants. I told you we show you that map. Again, you can see California and Texas being the number 1 and 2 state there. Again, quite a bit in the American Southwest and also in the kind of the Northeast as well. We look at kind of the states from Illinois all the way across to Pennsylvania there. We call that area kind of the Rust Belt, or have in the past. So some industry is involved there. We look at mining involved in those areas too. And we also see a lot of population growth in the American Southeast as well. So there's that going on as well. Plus proximity is playing at it here. We see obviously proximity to Mexico with California and Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and even Florida, right, when we look at the Caribbean islands. So here's your unauthorized immigrants in the United States from 1990 all the way up to 2016. So again, you can see the rise was pretty steady, up to about 12 million or a little bit more. And then you can see a kind of an even out and evened out to about 11 million or so after that. A little bit more with immigration policy. What is the United States' policy? What have we had in the past? And so when we look at historically, we have established quotas. When we talk about quotas, that's a maximum limit of people that are allowed to come in from a specific region or a specific country. And so there is no U.S. immigration policy until 1921. And in 1921 and in 1924, they enacted quotas, which were basically designed to discriminate against people who were not from North or Western Europe. And so we have kind of a history of trying to exclude different groups from coming to the United States. In 1882, there was what they called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a policy put in place to stop Chinese immigrants from coming here. We look at both Eastern and Southern Europeans were viewed as more violent and threats to jobs and salaries. So there was quotas put in place against people from Eastern and Southern Europe historically. We also talk about some of the changes that we've seen eventually to include hemispheric country caps. So no more than 7% of people could come from one country at a different time. And so in 1990, we look at about 700,000 people here were brought in versus for U.S. immigration here. And so that quota was established kind of at that time. All right, the newest one anyway, I should say, was in 1990. There are plenty of pathways for U.S. citizenship, though. And so when we talk about applicants and we talk about ways for people to become citizens in the United States, there are way more applicants than there are the number of quota. All right. And so when we talk about that, the preferences tend to be given to 3 levels of people. All right. The first is if it is a family member to be reunified. All right. So we talk about 2/3 to about 3/4 of all immigrants are usually some kind of family reunification, meaning a close family member, a spouse, a child, a sibling, or a parent already lives in the United States. And so they want to make sure to reunite that family together and allow the rest of that family into our country. And so we look at that, about 7% of the country cap applies to family reunification. The next is skilled workers. There's about 140,000 green cards given out every year, and that's very difficult to get. That is kind of a work visa. It's a given amount of time that you can be in the country to work. They are temporary, and they are typically dependent on whatever your employer or your job happens to be. And so those skilled workers, again, it's about 7% of the country cap applies right to that skilled worker and green card. Finally, you have the diversity lottery is what we kind of call it. And that is 50,000 of these positions or these pathways are given out. All right, there's 22 million applicants typically in a normal year. And so you have about a 0.2% chance of winning this application and making your way into the country via diversity lottery. And so this is really only for people coming from countries with low U.S. immigration rates. Again, all of these people are background checked. There is no allowing, they don't allow, people who are criminals into the country. And they are all vetted, and it takes a long time. This is not a quick process. It takes about 5 years minimum for people to follow these pathways to U.S. citizenship. A little bit more with U.S. immigration policy. We look at refugees are also allowed in. They're not counted in the quota. Refugees are people obviously who are fleeing some kind of poor situation in the country they're coming from, so refugee status or people seeking political asylum. If you look at in 2015, there was about 110,000 people that were allowed in. That was the cap for the year. In 2019, far less. There's about 30,000 people allowed in. And so you can see our policy has changed in that amount of time, that 4 years. One other thing or a couple other things we can look at is brain drain. Brain drain is when we see large-scale emigration of talented people due to skilled worker preferences. And so people may be leaving a certain country because they don't have that something again with that country is not allowing them to practice whatever their skilled position might be or skilled job might be. All right, and so we tend to see that the United States will allow in people who are highly educated from other countries before they'll allow other people in. That is a brain drain situation. We also look at family-based migration. There's migration to a specific location where family has already migrated to. And so family-based migration looks at people coming to a location because their family members already live there. And that's kind of their preference, so that they have people and family and friends in that new place. What's not in your book is something called chain migration. That's actually what family-based migration previously had been called. This is migration that's established because of cultural or family communities. And when we look at that, immigrant communities exist in the Twin Cities that we look at as being part of chain migration or family-based migration. And so if you look at St. Paul and Minneapolis, they're really good examples of this family-based or chain migration situation. In St. Paul, we have a very large population of Hmong people. And those people, again, came, some families came here to begin with, and other families came because of the community and the other Hmong cultural aspects of St. Paul. Same thing with Minneapolis. Minneapolis has the largest population of Somali people outside of the city of Mogadishu. And so a lot of people, again, that chain migration, that family-based migration, where some people came here to begin with and others came and followed because of the cultural basis of people who were Somali. A couple of green slides for you, ladies and gentlemen, as we look through and we look at isolationism. And this is the idea of a country trying to stay out of any foreign entanglements, as they say. And this was actually the United States policy and ideology following World War I. We wanted to stay out of all issues from anywhere else in the world. And that led us into a little bit of some trouble when we looked at World War II starting in Europe. Eventually, we would get involved in the war there in the late 30s, early 40s. We look at selective immigration, another green slide, not in your book. And this is when we have immigrants from certain backgrounds, whether it's poor health or criminal records or some of the issues with politics, they are barred from entering a country. And the USA put some of these bias quotas in place like this, allowing in certain people with certain backgrounds and not allowing others. And we talked a little bit about the Chinese Exclusion Act earlier. Australia has done some of these same selective immigration practices as well. Singapore has, anyone who comes to Singapore has to be financially secure. New Zealand has done some of these against the British, and Brazil has given selective immigration to people who have a farming background, wanting them to come into their country. When we look at kinship links, this is another one of your green slides here. This is an influence of family and friends who have already found success to immigrate. And so that is a pull factor to people. People want to be where their family already is. And the thing that's really sped up kinship links and this idea of migration with your family has been modern technology. And so when we look at some of the examples there, the Turks in Germany, a lot of Turks have left Turkey and gone to Germany. Germany needs people. They have a low growth rate for their population. They also have more jobs than people. And so they need people to fill those jobs. So a lot of Turks have left Turkey and gone to Germany. A lot of Algerians have headed to France for the same kind of idea for jobs. And they follow those people. So it's similar to like the chain migration or the family migration. We also talk about the reconnection of cultural groups. Israel is our greatest example of this. As a push-pull factor, Israelis' Jewish migration stream has changed from the cultural landscape of that entire region. Right in the 1900s, there's about 50,000 Jewish people in the Middle East there in that region. Today, as of 1948, I should say, there was 750,000 people, and that was the year that they established Israel as a state or a country in the Middle East, or reestablished it, I guess. And so obviously that massive increase after the fall of the Soviet Union, Jews were trapped in the Soviet Union as well. They eventually left and came to Israel as well. And we see modern Israel today has a population of about 6.5 or 6.4 million people who are Jewish. All right. Looking at some of the Twin Cities residents here, this is as of 2010, so it's a little bit old at this point, but you can see that each one of those dots represents 100, in this case 100 Latino residents in and around the Twin Cities. This one is our Hmong residents. Again, you can see that St. Paul specifically, but obviously parts of Minneapolis there and the northwest area too. And then we get into some of our other groups here. Everyone actually represented in the Twin Cities here. And so you can see everything. It gets kind of tough to see because these are all supposed to be dots still. But yes, you can kind of see the between the white, black, Asian, Hispanic, and then they have it listed as other, just because there's other groups in there that aren't being represented individually. That's, again, 10 years old. That's from the 2010 census. We don't have the 2020 census information quite yet, but soon. So what are some of the U.S.-Mexico border conditions? We've talked, or you've heard a lot about this in the last couple of years, the idea of building a wall and the border wall and what's going on between the U.S. and Mexico. About a quarter of the border between the U.S. and Mexico has wall, all right, some sort of wall of some kind. So it's really not very much. It's a pretty long border. When we look at it, what are some of the concerns? The concerns that have gone with it are, number one, security. Is the border safe? And a majority actually want more secure borders, but they oppose having a wall built at the border. All right, so it's kind of a oxymoron, right? We want secure borders, but we don't want walls built at borders. We look at workplace. Many immigrants are seeking jobs. Most Americans recognize that unauthorized immigrants do fill the jobs that most people don't actually want. So when we're talking about the U.S.-Mexico conditions here, most U.S. citizens realize that those jobs are being filled by unauthorized immigrants. When we look at the support for this, the work legal program and pathways to citizenship are what most people in most workplaces are trying to strive to see happen in the United States for our policies. When we talk about civil rights and looking at how to verify citizenship, Americans favor officials stopping and verifying status, but fear that could be a civil rights violation. Obviously, if you see someone that you might think is not a citizen and then they stop them, that is clearly a civil rights violation. And quite frankly, stereotyping and possibly racist, and there's all kinds of connotations that kind of go along with that possible civil rights violations. We look at local initiatives, and most Americans look at kind of whose job is it to police the border. And we've seen Border Patrol, we've seen the federal government, we've seen the local governments of those areas. Most people say this is a federal issue, not a local issue. And we've seen more money invested into the federal government and the protection of the border in recent years. Finally, as we get into the last few things here, how do other nations manage immigration? We've talked a lot about the United States. When we look at other nations, Europe specifically uses a guest worker program. They are then those workers are protected by labor laws, and there's a growing portion specifically of Western Europe's workforce is this guest worker program. Workers coming from Eastern Europe and coming from even parts of the Middle East a little bit to come into these other Western European countries and make money. All right, and so we tend to see a lot of them are low-skilled jobs or low-status jobs, and most are coming from, at this point now, North Africa, Asia, and of course, Eastern Europe, like we said. This obviously could be very beneficial. Any host country benefits from having their jobs filled. Specifically, like Germany is a really good example of that. Again, they have more jobs than they have people in their country, and they have a low population growth. And so bringing immigrants in and bringing guest workers in is a great way for them to keep their economy running. We also can see that there's challenges to new immigrants today as well. If we look at throughout history, there's been many periods of immigrant suspicion in the United States. We look at some of the recent issues of like illegal immigration. We look at immigration assimilation, people being forced to assimilate or to become part of the culture of the United States versus keeping their own culture. And that's always been a sticking point. And that's always been an issue when we look at the United States. Today, we look at it more as people are more allowed to keep their own culture, right? We also talk about guest workers in Europe and Asia also have some challenges that they face. Most of them tend to be poor. They are sending remittances back home, and they face a lot of opposition from people who are the native people to those countries. And so we look at that overall idea of xenophobia, right? The idea of someone else who's different from you coming into your country, all right? And so when we look at some of the strong feelings of xenophobia in the United States, we've seen it with people who are Muslim or Arab when we looked at some of the problems that popped up after 9/11. We've seen it with the Irish. We've seen it with the Catholics. We've seen it with all kinds of other groups who have historically come to the United States that have had this xenophobia, or the people have had xenophobia here in the U.S. So you can see some of those workers coming into those countries. Again, Germany is one of the biggest countries receiving migrants. You can see Ireland's in there, Norway, Sweden receiving quite a few as well, Austria, Switzerland. And again, a lot of them coming from the Eastern European areas, or you can see Turkey in there, Kazakhstan, and so North Africa. All those flows heading towards those more developed countries for sure. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. So make sure you wrap everything up, and good luck on your test in a day or two.